This is Colin O'Keefe with another episode of LXBN TV. After much bickering, posturing, and pontificating, Republicans and Democrats in Congress finally reached a deal to avert going over the fiscal cliff. Joining me now to break down the American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012 is Michael Walker, attorney with Samuels, Yoelin, Kantor in Portland, and author on the Wealth Law blog. Michael, first, give us the basics. What are the most important points in this deal?
Well, Colin, first of all, the title is interesting. The American Taxpayer Relief Act of 2012. It actually was not passed by either House of Congress until January 1st, 2013. So even the name may be a misnomer, but this is really the long and awaited tax solution to the fiscal cliff that we've heard so much about in the media. And I'll go through some of the high points here in terms of the issues that I think are going to affect most people. First of all, the individual income tax rates. For really the vast majority of taxpayers, this act retains the 2012 tax rates, and those are the 10, 15, 25, 28, 33 and 35% brackets, depending on one's level of income. Now, the additional bracket, what that really does is return to the top bracket that existed during the Bill Clinton administration. That's 39.6. And that applies to income over certain threshold amounts. So if you are a joint filer, with you and a spouse, that threshold amount for you is $450,000. So that 39.6 bracket would apply to income that is in excess of that threshold amount. If you are a single individual, a single filer, that threshold amount for you is $400,000. Now, these amounts are also adjusted for inflation. So as inflation may change the value of a dollar, these amounts are going to increase to deal with that. Another issue that really was a restoration of a provision that we saw in the tax code in some earlier years is what's called the PEP, or the personal exemption phase-out limitation. And what that does is all of us have a personal exemption that's available to us depending on ourselves and if we're married and the number of exemptions we have. What this PEP limitation does is, for certain higher income taxpayers, it phases that limitation out, and in effect it's another means in which the effective tax rate for those higher income taxpayers are increased. Now, the threshold amounts for the PEP phase out is $300,000 for joint filers and $250,000 for single filers. A similar limitation that we see is for those of us that are filing a Schedule A, where we put different itemized deductions, things like deductions for mortgage interest and charitable contributions and state taxes, where we deduct those on our return. Those are on Schedule A itemized deductions. And again, we have a provision where we have a restoration of a provision of the tax code that was sometimes called the PEACE limitation. That's PEASE. And what that does is, for taxpayers, again, joint filers over $300,000, single filers over $250,000, it effectively, over those benchmarks, it begins to reduce the allowable itemized deductions that those taxpayers can take. And there's a formula for that, and we probably don't need to get into the specific formula today, but suffice to say, for taxpayers over those limitations, the PEP and PEACE limitations are going to come into play.
Very interesting. And second, this is something that we talked about earlier off the air, and that's that many of the items in this deal don't include the sunset provisions that we've previously been used to in other tax legislation. Why is that so impactful going forward?
Well, I think for individuals and for business owners, for the last couple of years, we've lived in a scenario where we have these sunset provisions. Before 2010, from 2001 to 2010, we had these provisions that are referred to as the Bush tax cuts. that were going to, in effect, expire, and we would go back to the tax code as it existed before those Bush tax cuts. And so we've lived in this environment before 2010, and in 2010 there was just a 2-year extension that took us up to the end of 2012, where we really didn't know the nature of what the tax code would look like after that sunset. I don't think anyone really seriously thought that we would go off the cliff and we return all the way back to where the tax code was in the Clinton years. But on the other hand, we didn't know where things were going either. So at the end of the day, that uncertainty, I think, for a lot of taxpayers, a lot of small business owners, had a chilling effect. As it relates to income taxes and capital gains, all of these provisions are now permanent. So some taxpayers may pay more taxes, but at least for budgeting and planning going forward into future years, these provisions are permanent. So people can project forward and know, subject just to increases in inflation, that will in effect lower the effective rates on the same amount of income. People can plan forward and maybe can budget, and one could argue that maybe has a stimulative effect on the economy, just removing that part of the uncertainty that the tax code was inflicting upon us here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's always good to have a few less cliffs out on the horizon, and I think that's something that this aims at eliminating. Again, that was Michael Walker of the Wealth Law Blog. See more of his insight at wealthlawblog.com. And for an almost astounding amount of commentary from the Lex Blog Network's thousands of authors on the fiscal cliff, just go to lxbn.com, search Fiscal Cliff, and then click on that tag for our dedicated and curated Fiscal Cliff section, which is now several pages long, thanks to authors like Michael. Thank you, Michael, for joining me today.
Thanks, Colin.